Now it's recording. All right. Very good. It's nice to see everyone again. Sorry for my absence last week, but my throat has recovered and I'm able to talk again, as you can hear. So we are going to get the show underway as we tackle Parashat. That was last week. We had a double Parashat last week, which means we're now up to Emor. Parashat Emor, which is not exactly the Parashat that most people think of as being stirring and interesting and inspiring. There's that wonderful section that we read from when it talks about many of the different holidays from the Jewish calendar. But there's an awful lot of material in here that most people think, this doesn't apply to me. And I'm talking about the stuff that deals with our wonderful Kohanim. So, as there is only, as far as I'm aware, one Kohen in the room, that doesn't mean everyone else checks out. We tend to act that all of the special rules that apply to the Kohanim are special rules that apply to the Kohanim, and therefore the rest of us aren't involved, don't need to be that interested, or have nothing specifically to learn from them. Not true, as we're going to see. We're going to look at a very particular aspect of the rules of Kohanim, and how hopefully we can find a spiritual insight for ourselves in the process, whether or not we are Kohanim. So the Kohanim, of course, have the special job of priesthood, which means, what do? What's their job? They intercede for the nation of Israel. They play a very special role in the ritual life. In the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, that ritual life seems to be focused mostly around sacrifices, exactly. All the various animals and grain offerings and whatnot that they are taken care of. Up till this point, we have generally been getting the perks of being a Kohen. They get this special status, they get these special jobs, they get special things to eat, they get special compensation for what they are doing. We haven't reached the part yet where we find out they get no land. So at the moment it seems like being a Kohen is just a winning proposition. Well, sure, you had that little episode with Nadav and Avihu, two of Aaron's sons, who kind of sort of showed that if you don't do it right, you can get dead. But on the whole, it's been looking pretty good. Well, now we get some other aspects of the Kahanic responsibilities. The first is there are certain limitations on mourning. Kohanim in general are not permitted to go and be involved with the dead, the deceased.
Except for relatives.
What's that?
Except for relatives.
Except for relatives?
Well,
not even that general.
Mother and father.
Except for only the immediate circle of relatives. Right? So if a Kohen's nephew passes away, the Kohen does not go to the cemetery. Then they can go to the Shiva house, and they can be there for the family and help perform the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim, providing comfort. But as far as being in the same room with the deceased or being in the cemetery, no, they are not allowed.
So it's mother, father, sister, brother.
Exactly. All you have to do is draw a circle. You have the mother and father, sister and brother and spouse, and children. That's it. Anyone else, as long as there is another human available to bury them, they should have nothing to do with the burial or being in the cemetery or whatnot. If there is no one else to bury them, if it is a met mitzvah, if it is an unattended body entirely, then yes, they should attend to them.
If we're all ritually impure, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago.
You mean at this time, right?
Yeah. Why is it still a custom or a law that the Kohen can't be in the same room as a mason?
Very good question that we don't have time to go into. But you're absolutely right. If, as we talked about before, according to Jewish law, we are all considered ritually impure, why should a Kohen still, when we know he's ritually impure from the moment of birth until the moment of his own death, be limited in who or who he's not able to attend of a funeral or to be in the same room as the mate of the body? The short answer is, just because the Kohanim are not eligible, like the rest of us, to be performing services at a temple which has not yet been built, doesn't mean they are at liberty to ignore the commandments that God puts down in Parashat Emor, which is you are not allowed to willingly defile yourself on behalf of these others. The more complicated question of, but are I already defiled? We'll have to leave for another time, or personal conversation. Okay, so we get this whole discussion of who they can and can't bury, who they can and can't marry as well. There are further restrictions for Kohanim of who they can or cannot marry compared to the rest of us regular Israelites. So for example, a Kohen is not eligible to marry a convert, most famously. And there are some special restrictions on the behavior of their own family. And then we get to the section we're going to get down to after one more question.
Isn't it true that they could be disqualified if they don't have missing an eye or blind or things like that?
Thank you for bringing us to the section we're about to discuss. So clearly you are a Navi, you are a prophet, because that is exactly the part that we're going to turn to. So if you could look in chapter 21 of the book of Leviticus, verse 16. And we're actually looking at page 719 if you are in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. But it is chapter 21 of Leviticus, beginning with the verse number 16. Okay, we all on the right page? Excellent. Do I have a volunteer to read a rather uncomfortable list of problems?
And Adonai spoke further to Moshe, am I right?
Yeah, the Lord spoke, yeah.
And Adonai spoke to Moshe, speak to Aaron and said, no man of your offspring throughout the ages who has a defect should be qualified to offer food of Hashem.
Okay, so let's make sure we understand that the word defect here is the Hebrew word, which will, how would we put this in English? Mum, or we could, I guess actually, let's make it a little bit shorter, but don't think that means mum. Mum, it's the word for defect that's being used here is a mum. It's a blemish. It's something that is a negative physical characteristic of the person in question. But in general, mum just means a blemish or defect. And it's saying that if someone has a mum, if a Kohen has such a defect, that they are not allowed to offer the food of his God. Let's keep going to see, first of all, what those defects can be, and then what that might mean in practical terms.
No one at all who has a defect should be qualified. No man who is blind or lame or has a limb too short or too long. No man who has a broken leg or a broken arm, or who is hunchbacked or a dwarf, or who has growth in his eyes, or who has a boil scar or scurvy or crushed testes. No man among the offspring of Aaron and the priest who has a defect should be qualified to offer Adonai's gift. Having a defect, he should not be qualified to offer food to Adonai, and he may eat of the food of Adonai, of the Most High, of the Most Holy, as well.
Yeah. Of the most holy as well as of the holy.
Okay. So he should not enter behind the curtain or come near the altar, for he has a defect. He should not profane these places sacred to me, for I, Adonai, has sanctified them. And thus Moshe spoke to Aaron and his sons and to all Israelites.
Okay. Clear enough? No Kohen that has a mum is allowed to officiate in the tabernacle or the later temple sacrificial services. Sound fair? So he gets nothing, right? Come on,
No,
read
he gets
carefully.
to eat.
Okay. What does he get?
He gets to eat.
Okay, he still gets to eat. Let's make sure we understand this. All right, so if a Kohen has, for example, been taking care of a burial, even one of the ones that he was allowed to, and he comes back, and there has been a sacrifice or there has been a gift of truma, is he allowed to eat of it while he is ritually impure from having been with the deceased?
If the period is over.
And before the period's over, he comes right back from the graveyard, and there's a wonderful truma feast which is one of the special offerings that, the Kohanim were allowed to eat, but they could only eat while they were ritually pure. Is he allowed to chow down? No. He has to wait for the period of cleansing, and if it was with a body that he became impure, he has to go through the ritual of the ashes from the red heifer, etc., and then, no problem, eat as normal. Here we have a Kohen who, let's imagine, is perfectly fine. He is ritually pure, hasn't gone through any issues with that, and someone brings out the truma, but he has a mum. He has a blemish of one of the types listed here, or something else that might disqualify. Is he allowed to sit down at the truma feast?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we understand we're not talking about a ritual impurity here. We are talking about a blemish which is disqualifying him from the altar service, not from things that are sanctified. So it's not saying that somebody who is blemished has no place within the sanctity of the temple. They just don't have a place officiating with regards to the temple services. They can enjoy and partake of things that are holy, and even of the most holy, just like all the other Kohanim. But they are not allowed to officiate like the other Kohanim.
What is scurvy? I'm not sure I know.
What is scurvy? Scurvy is a disease that, or a condition that a person contracts from vitamin deficiency, most notably vitamin C. And it bends the bones and body.
Like rickets?
It's similar to rickets from what I understand. You probably know the word actually from all those old pirate movies. Scurvy dog. Because scurvy was a very common ailment for sailors. Because if you're out at sea a lot, you don't get a lot of oranges, you don't get a lot of vitamin C, and therefore they might contract it. And in fact, the British Navy instituted the carrying of limes on board, and hence the British gained the nickname as being limeys. In case you ever wondered why the British were called limeys. Not that you should call them limeys, but as far as national epithets go, it's one of the least offensive, but it's still not exactly a pleasant term. But it actually came from their insight into medical knowledge of having a little bit of vitamin C would really keep their sailors in much better shape. Ship-shape in Bristol fashion.
The Germans used sauerkraut.
Is that what they used?
Yeah.
And hence they were called krauts.
Yeah.
way to name people after their food. Okay. So that's scurvy. There's enough of a digression into medical terminology, but I want to make sure that we had a firm understanding of this notion of being blemished disqualifies you from the altar. It doesn't disqualify you from things that are holy. So this is different than being ritually impure. Someone can be of perfect body and be ritually impure and not allowed to eat the things that are coming off the altar. Someone else can be ritually pure but not of perfect body and not be allowed to go near the altar but can eat the things that are coming off of it.
Is that why Aaron's the priest and not Moses? Moses would be considered to have had a speech impediment. Would that put him in the classification?
Probably not. We'll see. We'll talk about that maybe. But since Moses actually has stood at the altar, and Moses has functioned as a priest, even though he doesn't become a priest in perpetuity, and certainly his children do not, it may not be a disqualifier. Because we know that Moses actually served as the Kohen until his brother and nephews were inaugurated. So Moses has been at the altar, and if God didn't want him at the altar for that reason, then he would not have been permitted to do so. Okay, but let's take this notion of the altar a little bit more. I want you to take a quick look. If you turn to page 722, we're now in chapter 22 and verse 17.
Lord spake to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelite people, and say to them, When any man of the house of Israel or of the strangers of Israel present a burnt offering as his offering for any of the votive or any of the freewill offerings that they offer to the Lord, it must to be acceptable in your favor.
All right, we're going to pause there because we got lots of other stuff to do, but it goes on to describe more of the potential defects and categories of offerings that might be coming. But the basic principle is, if I want to bring an animal to the altar, a mammal I should say, birds have a much lower threshold. They just have to make sure that they haven't been missing a limb. But if I want to bring a mammal to the altar, what condition does it need to be in? Perfect, without blemish whatsoever, without a mum at all. Similarities to what we described about the Kohanim?
Yeah, especially when we get to the next.
What's that?
verse. Especially when we get to the next verse.
Because
The defects that are listed, some of them are the same.
the defects seem to be quite the same. I'm going to argue no, that these are two unrelated restrictions. All right, you're going to have to stand by for me to justify that, but I wanted to throw that out there from the beginning, that I believe the restriction on who can officiate at the altar and what can be placed on the altar are two separate restrictions that happen to both be talking about a mum, about a blemish, but are doing so for two very, very different reasons. Okay on that? I'm not saying you have to buy it yet because I haven't tried to prove it yet. But I want you to understand that that's where we're headed in this conversation. And you can argue and kick and scream as I try and drag you to that position. All right, so Michael already brought up that when it comes to the modern world, the Kohanim are still under many restrictions, most notably for most families, the restriction of not being able to go to a cemetery or a funeral, or to even help take care of a deceased if it's not one of the immediate relatives. But Kohanim, despite not having a temple, do get certain perks.
First aliyah.
What's that?
The first aliyah.
The first aliyah is the one that everybody remembers. The Kohanim receive the first aliyah when we are reading from the Torah. So Michael, perhaps you'd like to read in honor of the Kohanim.
And you shall make the priest Kodesh. The school of Yishmael taught make Kodesh in all
Which
matters,
means to make holy,
make holy in all matters connected to Kedusha.
holiness.
To open first, that is to receive the first aliyah, to bless first, that is to lead the Birkat Hamazon, and to get first choice on the best portions.
All right,
I
so
like that part.
you like that part. First choice in the best portions. That in particular sounds nice. So Rabbi Ishmael is teaching that from the phrase from our parashah here where it says that we will make the Kohanim holy. What it's saying is that in the process of our attitude towards them generally, not necessarily what's happening in the temple, but what's happening generally, the community sanctifies the Kohanim by giving them the first aliyah, by giving them the first right to say Birkat HaMazon, and by giving them first dibs on the grub. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Okay, let's keep going and see maybe why we might be doing this.
The Kohen reads first, the Levi after him, and Israel after him, because of the ways of peace.
Mipnei darkei shalom. So the order that we have for our aliyot with Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael is being instituted, well, according to this section and the Mishnah and Gittin, not necessarily to sanctify the Kohanim, but why?
To keep peace.
To keep peace.
Because Kohanim are known to have bad tempers, do you know that?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that talking to a Kohen. The Kohanim are known to have a bad temper might be one explanation, right? If we're trying to keep peace, then one threat might be that if the Kohen doesn't get the first aliyah, he's going to kick and scream and throw a tantrum and be really, really upset. Yes? That might be one explanation of what it means by keeping the peace by having this order of aliyot. Any alternative or competing explanations of how having this order might also keep the peace in a way that isn't quite as pejorative to the character of the Kohanim?
Order in anything gives peace, a sense of security, of quietness, of comfort.
If we know there's an order generally,
Yeah.
it can quell possible arguments or friction or fights because we have a sense of peace
Yes.
from knowing
Just
things are going to follow a certain order. So one of the beauties of our Siddur, of the the order that we use for our services means that we know what's coming next, and our spiritual journey can be routine. Routine is not a bad word. Routine means that it's an easy thing for us to access rather than constantly being yanked back and forth on our spiritual walk. Okay, very good.
There was also already an order set up, even for the Mishkan, where, what time.
We were ordered of who was walking where and who was arranged by under which flag in the troops of marching, and who set it up and who broke it down and who carried what. So order definitely seems to be the order of the day. Order is the order of the day. Sorry, I was sick last week, so my jokes are still off. But there's another aspect of this which perhaps we're not focusing on, which is the Israelim.
It might instill respect by the rest of the population for the Kohen as being superior.
If we see the Kohen going first, it gives us a sense of respect and perhaps awe, which can be useful for the community, since there are some functions the Kohanim still perform where it's important that we respect them. When they are blessing the community, when they are doing Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn, it's good that the community respect them, and giving them the first Aliyah might help instill a little bit more respect.
The only time I ever saw that differently, huh? Yeah, at a bar mitzvah, and there was several hundreds of people at this bar mitzvah, and there's only so many Torah honors you can give for the bar mitzvah kid.
You pretty much got 7 aliyot plus the maftir, and the maftir is usually going to the bar mitzvah kid.
And so you're losing 2 if you have to give the Kohen. So the rabbi stood up and he said, how many of you here are Kohanim or Levite? And they raised their hand. Would you go outside? We'll come and get you. And like 50 men stood up and went out, so the rest of Israel would still be able to then it's like you can.
So in that case, for the sake of peace, they all left.
Right.
Which the notion being that if there's no Kohen available, then the aliyahs are up for grabs.
Right.
But let me focus on that. If there's no Kohen available, then the aliyot are up for grabs.
Levites come before the rest.
What's that?
Levites come before the rest.
Well, yeah, well, Levites have their own role to play, but let's imagine there was no Kohen, no Levites, or let's imagine there was no rule about who came first, who came second, who came third.
Everyone would.
I'm first.
And
I want to be first.
Order.
Why should you go before me?
Yeah. My parents did this, or.
The arguments over our own individual yichus, our own individual parentage or lineage, and why we should deserve it, the arguments over who is greater or lesser within the community can become quite fractious. What's that?
Who gave the most money?
Who gave the most money certainly can factor into the argument. And I personally think that part of the peace that's being kept here is not just quelling the argument about the Kohanim stamping in the corner, but is also quelling the rush to the bima of everybody who thinks they should be first. Because if we know number 1 is reserved for the Kohanim, then I know I'm not getting it as a non-Kohen.
Well, isn't that true also when he set the tribes at different locations?
Because if he hadn't set them, what would have happened? Everybody would have either rushed to the front to be first, or those perhaps less noble would have rushed to the back to not be in the danger of being in the vanguard. Whereas if you have everybody organized, then no one can complain about where they are because they're set where they're supposed to be set. And removing the room for complaint is a very important aspect. As you read the next line from Shulchan Aruch,
even if the Kohen is an ignoramus, they still read first, even before the wisest scholar in Israel.
if we were to leave it to most of the other ways that we rank people within the community, which is often by scholarship and by their ability to teach and to lead the community, then you would get into consistent arguments of who is the smartest person in the room, who is the greatest scholar. That's a lot harder to establish than who's a Kohen. Who's a Kohen? If your dad was a Kohen, you're a Kohen, get up there. Whereas I think my rabbi is smarter than your rabbi, and I think this guy is better than that guy. it becomes a much more contentious issue of who's going to go first. And indeed, beyond the Kohanim, there are many other rules of who is a bridegroom, who is the recent parent of a newborn, who is has a yard site, and other reasons as well, which factor into who gets what aliyah or who gets preference for an aliyah.
There's another aspect that sometimes when you push somebody forward, they feel like they have to live up to the responsibility that you're doing.
We would hope. We would hope. And I would appreciate, and we'll throw a little commercial in here, many people actually now are reluctant to take aliyot. They feel uncomfortable. They're not sure if their Hebrew's good enough. They're not sure if they know the melody right for the blessing. If you happen to be like that, please come to our mitzvah fair this Sunday, and you will be given expert tutelage in all sorts of synagogue rituals and mitzvot that we perform, and hopefully increase your comfort level so the next time the gabbai comes around and says, would you like the third aliyah, you'll be able to say, I would love it. Thank you very much for the honor. Rather than, all right, so Sunday, please come if you can. All right, but let's continue because there's another little aspect of this.
Where there's no Levi in the synagogue, then the Kohen who reads first blesses the second time in place of the Levi. But a different Kohen is not called, lest people say that the first is flawed.
All right, let's make sure we understand that law. If we've got the Kohen up there, and he does the first aliyah, second aliyah comes round, we should have a Levi, a Levi. Let's say there's none available. Do we go to Kohen number 2, according to this ruling? No. We have Kohen number 1 do the second aliyah as well. So he's up there for 2 aliyot back to back. Same guy. And why do we do that? So we wouldn't give the impression that we were getting rid of him and making up for his aliyah with a better Kohen, with a real Kohen, with a non-defective Kohen. See how that works? See the psychology here? That if you were sitting in the congregation and Joe Kohen was up there and he had his aliyah, and then they say, is there a Levi here? And everyone says no. They go, oh, Frank Kohen will get the next aliyah. What was wrong with Joe Kohen? I mean, was there something that I thought we had a Kohen aliyah, but I don't know if Joe was really, was Joe's dad really a Kohen? You know, he came here and said he was a Kohen, but we didn't actually know his parents. Well, maybe the rabbi found out that Joe's not a Kohen. Maybe we're doing the second guy with Frank because Joe isn't really a Kohen. This is exactly what they're talking about. I'm sorry, is it impossible to imagine people muttering and gossiping about the lineage of fellow Jews?
Yes.
We would never talk about someone like that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, but if Joe were blemished in any way, he would have been called the first time.
Ah,
So why?
yes
Kohen?
or no?
But he's a Kohen.
What's that?
But he's a Kohen.
He's a Kohen. So to come back to our question from the parasha, if we had a Kohen that had a mum,
Yeah.
if we had a blemished Kohen, what is his status now? Is he allowed to get that first aliyah? He's going blind, he's missing a leg, he's in a wheelchair. Is he allowed to have the honor of that first aliyah? Or now that he is a mum, now that he is blemished, I should say, is he taken off the roster? He's sent off the bench, and it's time to hit the showers. I'm sorry, your service is no longer required.
I would not think so.
Don't think so?
No.
I thought it was to do the sacrifice.
You thought it was to do the sacrifices.
But
Well,
there's no more sex.
let's take a look. Okay. Well, Yolanda, since you've already brought it up, why don't you read? That way I don't have to keep picking on Michael for reading about the Kohanim.
Then there is no Levi in the synagogue.
Next one.
Next one.
If a
Kohen
Kohen.
has a defect, if a Kohen with a defect did perform the holy service, his service is considered desecrated and deemed invalid.
All right, so we had all this discussion about a Kohen with a mum shouldn't be at the altar, should not be in the tabernacle or later the temple. And then, of course, Sifra, one of the earliest halachic midrash collections, asked the question, well, what happens if someone shows up anyway? Because after all, some of the blemishes that we're talking about here are not necessarily the kind of thing that other people are going to point out while he's doing the service. They might find out later, but while he's doing it, they wouldn't necessarily see. For example, things involving the testes. It's not the normal way to conduct a service that makes that known. Is his service considered valid after the fact? If it turns out later that he had a blemish, according to Sifra, no. It's invalid. If he did the sacrifice and you find out that he had a mum, the sacrifice that he performed is null and void. And a new one would have to be done in its place.
It's really an insult.
What's that?
It's really an insult.
That's really an insult. I mean, can't we spare the guy some embarrassment? I mean, couldn't we just say, oh, sorry, Joe, didn't realize, but next week when we ask you to do the sacrifices, just say no. I mean, shouldn't we just spare them the embarrassment and not, have to redo the whole thing over again?
No.
Well, apparently not. Let's keep reading and see what else we can figure out about this.
One might suggest that the offender is to be cut off from one place to another.
The punishment for this, that is to say, the description of what happens according to the Torah is karet, which is a Hebrew word which literally means to be cut off. And so the Midrash is trying to figure out what does it mean to say that a Kohen who performs it while blemished is cut off. What does that mean? Well, you might think that cut off means from one place.
He shall be cut off from his place of residence and exile to settle in another place.
So you might think that cut off means kick out, right? We're cutting you off from the group. Here's your bag. There's the door. We don't want to see you no more. But that's not apparently what it means.
Torah therefore continues, I am the Lord, as if to say, I am in every place, and even if someone is sent into exile, I am also in that other place.
Right, so if we were exiling you as karet, as punishment, because in this place you had gone against God's law, well, what good is exile when God's everywhere? Right, you're not escaping God's gaze by moving to Spain, which was the ends of the earth at the time. You're still under God's eyes, and if you did something wrong, it doesn't matter where you go. When what you did was wrong to God. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. Instead,
hence the cutting off here refers to
excision.
Excision of the soul. That is, that he will die before his time.
So whenever the Torah mentions karet, our tradition understands that to mean not that you're getting kicked out of the group, but that you are getting kicked out of this life earlier than expected. Congratulations. You're getting time off for good behavior, right? Quite the opposite. So we shouldn't think that he is being kicked out of the community when it says that he'll be cut off from his people. We should understand that this is a serious offense. That means that God will take matters into God's own hand, and this person will be gathered before their time.
Pretty severe.
Pretty severe. And in fact, karet is generally considered to be a more severe penalty and more spiritually, a stronger spiritual criticism of the act than the death penalty. So somebody who murders and is sentenced to death by the court is technically has committed a lesser crime than somebody who is being punished by karet, than someone who has committed something which earns this as the punishment. So it is extremely severe. Well, why? I mean, why? I mean, the guy has a blemish. It's not like he went out and did it to himself. There is actually an argument in the Talmud about whether or not a Kohen can make a blemish to him. Talk about the after the year, which of course happens to the guy. They the door. If a slave and like master wants to stay there, can he stay? And the answer from the Talmud is no. That a Kohen is not allowed to deliberately make a mum or have a made for him situation. But in most situations, we're not talking about things that are self-inflicted. Remember, extreme sports weren't popular back then, so self-inflicting extraordinary wounds wasn't common. Most of the time that you would have a broken leg, arm, or go blind or such, it was not your fault. So why should the Kohen be punished by not being allowed to be at the altar? Yes?
Would a broken leg after it healed, would that still be considered a limb?
It's no longer a broken leg. And indeed, the sages say that any bloom that is, any blemish or mum, pick a language, any blemish that is temporary, when the blemish is gone, the Kohen was welcomed back to the altar. So if we had the temple in our own days, along with all the medical science that we have now, the various issues that have to do with the eyes, if someone was able to cure the blindness, or if they had cataracts, and if they were able to remove the cataracts, they would be back at the altar as soon as possible. So for us nowadays, many of the blemishes that are being discussed are perfectly healable, or curable. Back then, most of them were not. And even a broken arm or leg could often set incorrectly and stay that way for the rest of the person's natural life. So many of these things, like I said, it's not their fault. They did nothing to deserve this blemish. It may have either been genetic and they were born that way, or a disease that has crippled them, or some other accident or problem. Why shouldn't they be allowed to be at the altar? And why shouldn't we think that this is exactly the same as how we're treating the animals that aren't allowed to come with a blemish to the altar as well? Well, let's talk about the animals first. That might help. Why can't I bring a blemished animal to the altar? I mean, is God going to get sick if I give him an animal that has a disease when he eats the sacrifice?
No, it's disrespectful.
Right, so God doesn't get sick because God isn't eating the sacrifice, right? God doesn't digest the offerings, but it's disrespectful how? I mean, why is it disrespectful? I mean, God isn't eating it. God doesn't need the animal to build a bigger flock. God doesn't need the unblemished blood to somehow increase God's power and might. How can it be disrespectful?
Because he said to bring an unblemished animal, and if you bring one that's blemished, then you're disrespecting his word.
But if he didn't tell us to bring an unblemished animal for his own benefit, what would possibly be the reason?
Our intentions should be to give him the best that we have instead of our trash.
Our intention, our spiritual benefit, our spiritual sense of respect for what we are doing, not necessarily to God, that comes by extension, but the act that we are performing is only going to be fulfilled if we take what we're doing seriously enough to give our best and not our trash. That if I give you a birthday present that I pulled out of my trash, it's not going to be good for you, but more importantly, it's also not going to be good for me. I am going to feel like trash for having given you such a gift. And if I don't, then I'm a pretty reprehensible person. And the Torah is all about trying to keep us from being reprehensible people. So the act of bringing a blemished animal was not about disrespecting God. It was about having done something we wouldn't do for a human. We are now going to internalize, which will degrade not just God in our eyes, but degrade ourselves, the spiritual act, and the spiritual benefit will be missing from everything that was supposed to happen when we actually got to the altar. So if we bring a blemished animal, we, because of our narrowness, our short-sightedness, our inability to see the bigger picture, we are going to keep ourselves from experiencing that spiritual moment that was intended. And God doesn't want animals just to die for fun. He wants them to be sacrificed so we can reap the spiritual benefit of that moment of holiness. That make sense?
It fits in it fits in with the whole concept of Judaism, but everything you do is to show your respect and honor of God. So anything that you do, whatever effort you make, you should always think that you're doing this because God told you to be a good person.
Absolutely. And that same attitude that everything you're doing should be with the honor of God in mind, and because God has commanded it, is very easily short-circuited when the act is exactly the opposite. So if I say to myself, I'm doing this to show God my ultimate respect and love, and I'm bringing the sickest, oldest, nastiest cow I've got because it's going to die tomorrow anyway, and I don't want to lose one of my good ones, that intention disappears in a puff. And not a good puff on the altar, but a bad puff. So there is a very real concern that the physical act has to match the intention, or else the intention will be undone, can come unraveled very, very quickly.
What if that's all you have, and you really want to please Hashem?
So there are many, many categories of sacrifices, and many, what do you call it, a spectrum of acceptable offerings. So if you have an old nasty cow, and that's the only thing you've got left, and you use it for milking, and that's pretty much it, but it's in really bad shape, and you've got a very nice goat, you give the goat. Even though technically the cow is higher on the hierarchy of animals for sacrifices, you give the one that's perfect rather than the one that isn't. And it goes right down. If the only thing you have is some pathetic little dove, and it's not blemished, and it's not too hard to find a dove that isn't blemished. I said the animal blemishes are, the bird blemishes are, the birds are disqualified only if they are missing limbs. So it's not as strict as for the mammal blemishes. Then that's what you bring. So everybody will have the opportunity when they are bringing a sacrifice for themselves to participate in an unblemished sacrifice if they bother. And that's why the animals, it's actually quite easy to fulfill this. It's not an onerous burden unless you feel it is. And as soon as you feel it is, and you look further down your list of animals to find something cheaper or more throwaway, then you've already undone the whole purpose of the sacrifice, and it's better not to go at all. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so taking that in mind, taking that notion that the physical act can change the perception, the intention, and the benefit of what happens at the altar, let's go back to the guy who's actually officiating, not just the animal that's being sacrificed. We saw on the very first page, if the Kohen is an absolute ignoramus, does he get first aliyah or not?
Yes.
Absolutely. If that's the Kohen you got, and you got none better, then Mr. Kohen, who's not so bright, he still gets first aliyah. But why should we honor him? He doesn't deserve it, does he?
He's a Kohen.
He's a Kohen. He doesn't deserve it. The Kohen deserves it. He's just occupying the space of Kohen. Now, no offense to our Kohen in the room. Kohanim are interchangeable. The priests are interchangeable. It's not about them. It's about the job they fulfill for the community. And as such, Kohanim need to be invisible. When the Kohanim duchen, when they do the blessing for the community, how do they wear their talitot? All right, everybody's doing the gesture. I'll show that for the people at home. If they pull the talit up and over their head to shield their face. Why?
It's not the person, it's the
Because it's
whole
not
concept.
about the person. It's about the Kohen. And God forbid, someone in the congregation should say, I don't want the blessing from Frank because he's a jerk.
But then don't look.
It's a problem. I mean, there are certain things where a Kohen has really poisoned his relationship with the community, or vice versa, that the Kohen should excuse himself from duchening. But generally speaking, we want the Kohen to be up there, and we want him to be as anonymous as possible, because it's not about him, It's about the function that he is fulfilling for the community at this moment.
The first time we did it in synagogue, which was maybe about 10 years ago, we were told not to look. I mean, I just, you know, I just always just look down and wait for it
Right.
to finish.
And actually, in some communities, they have the custom of turning their back entirely, which is a mistaken custom, in my opinion. But that same idea of not looking is you're not supposed to look at the person.
Right.
You can look at the act,
Right.
but it's not the guy that matters.
Right.
The Kohanim were very easily the stars of the show when it came to the temple sacrifices. And they shouldn't be. They're not the star of the show. The star of the show is either the community, if it's a general sacrifice, the individual who is bringing the sacrifice, together with the co-star of God. The Kohen is just fulfilling the role and should be no more the focus than the stones of the altar. Again, my apology to the present company. Kohanim have every right to have individual expression and personal search for their own spiritual fulfillment, but they are not the focus. And unfortunately, as we know from our own day and age all too well, people who have Emor, people who are blemished, who are defective, who are disabled, all too often everyone else has a real hard time seeing past the disability, seeing past the blemish. And the Torah was concerned that the Kohanim who was officiating should not distract because of our human stupidity any more than absolutely necessary from the real focus, which was the person, the sacrifice, and God. And so to have them be unblemished was essential because of our own human inadequacy, that we would be unable to see past them in order to actually experience the deed. The Kohen needed to be invisible. And that may sound terrible to call people invisible, and it may sound terrible to believe that someone who was blemished couldn't fulfill that role. But all we have to do is look at our day-to-day life at how people stare, how they gawk, how they have difficulty talking with someone that has even superficial blemishes. You see someone talking to a person who has extremely bad acne, and people sometimes have difficulty getting past the fact that they have lots of pimples, to the point of talking to them like they would to anyone else. How much more so at the solemn moment of a sacrifice do we need to make sure that the person officiating doesn't become the focus and a distraction? And that's a sad statement about human nature, but it's also a very honest one. And I believe the Torah was trying to make sure we also protected them by saying very soon, the next line, after we say they're not able to go to the altar, that they are still part of the holy Kohanim, and they are still permitted to eat everything that comes from the altar, and they are still permitted to participate in all the rights and privileges and responsibilities apart from the altar that the Kohanim have. It was only at that flashpoint of holiness that we needed to make the Kohanim invisible. And people with these blemishes are not invisible.
It's not a punishment.
It's not a punishment. It's a punishment to the rest of us that we lose out on their services at the altar because we can't see past them. But it isn't that they've done something wrong. It isn't that there's some spiritual stain. It isn't that they are unfit for the service of the altar. It's we are incapable of seeing that they are fit. And because of our inability, unfortunately for this one moment only, they can't serve in this capacity. Which leads us to a story from modern days, and then to a reinforcement that comes from our Haftarah. So who'd like to read a short story? It's a tragic episode, far too common, unfortunately. No volunteers this time? Thank you.
A Kohen, the victim of Nazi persecution, was castrated. Can he still get the first aliyah?
All right, let's make sure we understand the question. If you have a Kohen, and this is a real story, but let's talk generically, a Kohen who was castrated by some evil force, in this case the Nazis, and it's well known, everybody knows this person has been blemished in this way, do they still get first aliyah? Or would we say, no, they don't get the first aliyah because they are now blemished and they wouldn't be allowed at the altar? Why should they be allowed at the shulchan for the Torah reading?
Rav Ashrei held that if there was no other Kohen, then the man can, since the elements of the priestly prerogative, including the right to receive the first aliyah, are not contingent on his serving at the altar at all. Or even when a priest is not entitled to serve at the altar, as halmun,
A
as
balmun,
balmun,
that's someone who has a blemish.
he nonetheless retains the sanctity of the priesthood, and he should be permitted to receive the first aliyah, as told by Rabbi Joel Roth.
The story came from a work by Rabbi Joel Roth. So the answer is, yes, he still gets first aliyah. Because these other rights and privileges are not contingent upon being at the altar any more than eating from the Holy of Holies. The sacrifices was contingent upon whether he could go to the altar or not. If he was ritually impure in general, then yes, he's not allowed to eat from the holiest of the sacrifices. But if he is blemished and ritually pure, absolutely, he can get his knife and fork out and eat. And similarly, a blemished Kohen in our own day is perfectly permitted to be up as the first aliyah and to serve as a Kohen for that purpose. Because although God was willing to give us a dispensation that at the flashpoint of holiness at the altar, that our human stupidity and inability to see past a disability would keep us from experiencing the holiness that we were supposed to at that moment, God's not giving us a free pass to treat people who have been maimed or disabled like that all the time. We're not allowed to treat them as second-class citizens and incapable of being part of our community just because we can't get over their disability. That only applies at that point of the altar, only because of the significance and the explosive nature of the sanctity that is supposed to take place there. For everything else, and everything else means you're coming way down in terms of the level of holiness, we should make every effort to make sure we do see the person and not the disability. That we do include them in every possible and conceivable way in our community and in our fellowship. And that if they are a Kohen, that first aliyah is their right. Make sense? All right, just to drive the point home, why don't you go ahead and finish off with the quote from the book of Ezekiel that we read as part of the Haftorah.
And when they enter the gates of the inner court, they shall
They, by the way, are the Kohanim.
They shall wear linen clothes. They shall have nothing woolen upon them when they minister inside the gates of the inner court. They shall have linen turbans on their heads and linen breeches on their loins. They shall not gird themselves with anything that causes sweat. When they go out to the outer court where the people are,
That's the rest of us.
they shall remove the clothes in which they minister and shall deposit them in the sacred chambers. They put on their other clothes, lest they make the people consecrated by their clothes.
All right. Basically what we just read is a very elaborate costume change. Right? While the Kohanim are ministering at the altar and performing the temple duties, they are wearing linen clothes of a particular type and even designed to make sure they don't get sweaty, lest they stand out. When they're done, they don't wear that home. That is left there in the temple, and they change into their regular clothes. Make sense? They're civis. Because they are only holy by virtue of all that function by being essentially anonymous, invisible. They should look roughly the same, and they should act roughly the same. And they are simply there as a tool for helping us to experience that moment in the temple. After that, they hang it up. We still respect them. They still have other responsibilities and other privileges. But now they can go back to being regular. Make sense? Regular with an asterisk next to the name. This notion that at the moment of holiness, they need to be invisible, however, is not just an important for teaching for the contrary, that at every other moment in the altar we need to be more respectful and welcoming to people with disabilities. But at that moment of holiness as well, we should also hold on to a very important teaching. We should recognize that the performance of the mitzvot is not all about us. Sometimes it's not bad spiritually, psychologically to think that way, of I am shaking the universe by the fact that I am performing a command of God. But that can be very uplifting, and that can help us to focus and to ensure that we do carry on the mitzvot. But ultimately, it's not about me, any more than when I'm standing up here teaching. It's not about getting you to like me or be impressed with my teaching. It's about you connecting to God through this experience. Similarly, when we perform acts of kindness, it's not about whether the person thanks me enough. It's not about whether or not the person is properly grateful and shows enough appreciation. It's not about whether I donate $1 million and get my name written across the front of a hospital. It's about doing what we should be doing. And sometimes, yes, recognition will come in the process of that, and it's good that people want to recognize and single out the nobility of someone's good deeds. And there's nothing wrong with that recognition, but we don't do it to seek the recognition. We do it because we should. And so I don't feel too bad for the Kohanim at the altar, who were essentially anonymous, because they had a wonderful role to play in helping the rest of the community to approach God in that special way. I don't feel too bad about the Kohanim who cover themselves with their talitot when they duchen, when they do the blessing, because they are fulfilling a wonderful function, and it isn't about them. But we need to remember that for the rest of us too, that when we perform a mitzvah, when we come to study, when we come to synagogue, when we're helping others, we shouldn't be looking for the honor and recognition that can come with that, but should be pleased by just the fact that we are able to do this wonderful thing at this time. With that, thank you very much, and hope you to see you next time.
Thank you, Rebecca.